Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs. The villains in some of America's most iconic horror movies were inspired by crimes dating back to the 1950s, committed by real-life killer and grave robber Ed Gein. What police found in his Wisconsin House of Horrors in 1957 rivaled any plot Hollywood screenwriters could imagine. An investigation into the disappearance of Bernice Worden, a shopkeeper who went missing, led authorities to Gein's home. There, they did find her body, mutilated and hanging upside down in a shed. That wasn't their only grisly discovery. They also found bowls made from skulls, human heads, women's body parts used to make furniture and household items, and both face masks and a woman's suit made out of human skin. The macabre findings, and Ed Gein's story, have had a lasting impact on pop culture for decades since. Most recently, Gein's story is spotlighted in the latest season of the Netflix series Monster. Harold Schechter, author of Deviant, the shocking true story of the original Psycho, joins Forbes True Crime to discuss the killer now known as the Butcher of Plainfield. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, the host of Forbes True Crime. Joining me now is Harold Schechter, author of Deviant and Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done? Harold, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It has been close to 70 years since the infamous Ed Gein admitted to arguably some of the most horrific crimes in American history. And the story is being revisited now in the newest season of Netflix's Monster. But for those who might not be as familiar with the name Ed Gein, I'm sure they are familiar with his story that has inspired horror movies like Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. But how would you describe the Butcher of Plainfield?
Well, first of all, there's one misconception about Ed Gein that needs to be corrected, which is he was not a serial killer. The term serial killer, which actually dates back to the 1930s, was specifically coined to describe a certain kind of sadistic sexual psychopath. And when it entered the language over here, because it was originally coined in Germany, it was used to describe or applied to killers like John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, the Night Stalker, etc. These were all extreme sadistic sex killers who derived their perverted pleasure from kidnapping and torturing and murdering helpless victims. That was not Ed Gein's MO. Gein was essentially a necrophile. He did kill two women, but he did not torture them. He did not subject them to these terrible atrocities in the way the killers I mentioned a moment ago did their victims. He basically dug up corpses, or in the case of his two victims, just created corpses. He executed these two women very swiftly. And he brought these bodies back to his remote farmhouse, dissected them, and made all of these ghastly objects out of their body parts. And a great deal of the fascination with Gein has to do exactly with that. All the stuff he made out of the body parts, which included a skin suit or part of a skin suit that he wore. And all of this pretty much had to do with his relationship with his mother, who was the overbearing, dominating figure in his life. And when she died, he tried to dig up her corpse and bring it home. And when he couldn't get to it, because it was buried in a concrete vault, he began digging up the bodies of women who resembled his mother, or in the case of his two murder victims, living women who resembled his mother. He was basically trying to resurrect his dead mother. And that's where a lot of the fascination with the Gein case comes from, because it was such a macabre, such a macabre crime taking place in the American heartland during this sunny, balmy Eisenhower era.
I'm actually really happy that you started with some of the misconceptions here, and arguably one of the biggest ones when it comes to Ed Gein, because he was a murderer, a grave robber, he mutilated corpses. When you, in your book Deviant, described the House of Horrors, I was listening to the audiobook and I was on a run and I was by myself, kind of in a wooded area. And I mean, it freaked me out so much that I got out of that wooded area as fast as I could. My split for that mile was incredible. That's how fast I was running. But his house was horrifying with what he did to body parts, how he used them for household items and furniture, face masks, the woman's suit made out of skin. I mean, why do you think there are misconceptions when it comes to Gein, especially because the reality is twisted enough?
Well, first of all, at least in popular entertainment, we're obsessed with serial killers. Serial killers have become the mythic monster of our age. So it's very easy, people who make these movies and documentaries and so on want to slot him into that category. And even at the time, people assumed, though the term did not exist, when they first found all these body parts in his farmhouse, that they had come from living victims. So the immediate suspicion was that Gein was, again, they didn't have the term serial killer back then. They would have called him a mass murderer. So that label, is easy to apply to Gein. And in some respects, Gein's crimes are so unimaginable, so unspeakable, so beyond the bounds of human comprehension that it's easier to categorize him as a serial killer than to describe him as what he was, for which no term, I mean, I say necrophile, but he wasn't really even a classic necrophile. Necrophilia refers to having sex with corpses. Gein, as far as we know, never consummated a sexual relationship with any of these dead bodies. He was using them, as you were saying a moment ago, to create all these ghastly objects and even to dress up in the flayed skin of his victims. So I guess what I'm saying is serial killer is just an easier way to think of him.
And people like Ed Gein only admitted to killing 2 women, but people do believe and suspect that he's had more victims. You are one of the leading experts when it comes to all things Ed Gein. You've written 2 books about him. What do you think, based on your research, your years of research, do you think he's had more victims, committed more crimes?
No, I don't. I think that the murders of the tavern keeper, Mary Hogan, and Bernice Warden, who ran the local hardware store, were his only homicides. When a sensational killer is arrested, police who have all these cold cases, flock to interview the accused perpetrator, hoping to solve these crimes. And every, unsolved murder in Wisconsin, basically, was attributed for a while to Ed Gein. But I don't believe Gein committed any but those 2 murders.
you pointed out in Deviant too that Ed Gein was seen as very unassuming. He was seen perhaps and portrayed perhaps in his community as a weirdo, as someone who was a strange guy, but no one who anyone would suspect of, committing these really monstrous crimes. The person that he was in his community did not square with these crimes that people found out about after. So do you think that that's where a lot of the fascination surrounding Ed Gein comes from?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That I sometimes have described Gein as uh, Barney Fife with a chainsaw. You know, he just seemed like this completely harmless, little oddball. So, the absolute split between his public persona, how people perceived him, which in many ways is what he was, and what was going on in his farmhouse was so extreme that a lot of the fascination derives, as you were saying, from that. Just this. Well, again, Alfred Hitchcock tapped into that, this incredible schizoid doubleness, which was part of the culture also. Uh, you know, the fact that the Gein crimes happened in the midst of this sunny, optimistic, benign, white bread era America, and then in the middle of the country, in this farmhouse, Wisconsin farmhouse, you had this guy performing these hideous rituals. Again, that split, between what the was going on in the country and these activities, the split between Gein's public, uh, again, public persona as this harmless, you know, kind of, very mild mannered, uh, slightly goofy individual, and the things that were taking place in his home does account for a lot of the fascination with him.
And Mary Hogan was a someone who worked at a tavern. She went missing in 1954, and then it was later revealed Ed Gein admitted to killing her. And something that stuck out to me, and you note this in your book Deviant, is he would joke, Ed Gein would joke and say every time Mary Hogan was brought up, he would say, yeah, she's back at the house or something to that effect. And
Yeah,
people thought it was, an off joke, off putting joke, maybe a little morbid humor, but they
yeah.
certainly did not suspect, hey, he's actually serious and her body is at his house and has been for years. So I think that that really illustrates the double identity, really, of Ed Gein. But like I said in this conversation, you are an expert on his story. There's so many shocking, disturbing, grisly facts. What is the most shocking to you?
Well, the whole everything that went on is shocking. I mean, let me make a point about why I think uh, Gein has maintained this fascination. Um, he's really become a kind of mythic figure, which is why his story continues to be told and retold in all these different versions. And I wasn't a true crime writer when I wrote Deviant. I had been writing books on various subjects. And Gein was not really well known at that time. I mean, he certainly was known among a certain fringe element of true crime aficionados. Uh, but what interested me about the Gein case was that I came to see him as a kind of supernatural or fairy tale monster come to life. You know, if you look at any community, kids are always telling stories about some weird, there's always some weird guy or old woman living off the beaten path. And kids invent all these stories, about their witches or cannibal ogres or whatever. Uh, I grew up in the Bronx, in a 6-story apartment building, and there was a weird woman, old woman living on the 6th floor. And we used to tell stories about, that she was a witch, et cetera, et cetera. She was just a harmless cat lady. Or it's like To Kill a Mockingbird, Boo Radley. I mean, that happens all the time. In the Gein case, it was really true. you know, something like Hansel and Gretel. You want, off a little ways outside of the community, there's this creepy house with some weird guy living in it. And then it turns out, yeah, he was this monster. So there's something, as I said, almost kind of mythic about the story.
To that point, he really did go from this local ghost story legend
Mm-hmm.
to the most infamous killer in American history, one of them today. Every neighborhood has that type of person you see. I remember across the street from my neighborhood, there was this semi-abandoned farmhouse, a bunch of cats, and on the bus every day going to school, all the kids would think of a different story associated to that house. But do you think this fascination when it comes to Ed Gein, do you think really we saw that from when the story started in the 50s to now? Do you think that was really the origin of the true crime industry and this fascination with true crime that we know today?
No, I wrote a true, the interest in true crime dates at least as far back as the invention of the Gutenberg press. I was actually asked to be this year a consultant for the Guinness Book of World Records. They were doing a true crime section that just came out recently. And one of the entries that's in the book that I supplied had to do with the oldest true crime book in English, which dates back to Shakespeare's time. People have always been fascinated by true crime. I was also asked to edit an anthology for the Library of America called True Crime in American Anthology, and the first piece that appears in it dates back to the Mayflower Pilgrims. So there's nothing new about the public interest in true crime. Again, it has existed for as long as, well, in print, it's existed for as long as there has been such a thing as print. And it existed before that in terms of oral, what they call murder ballads. Every time a sensational murder happened, somebody would turn it into a poem or a song, and it would be transmitted that way. And certainly in the United States, uh, I guess the modern uh, fascination with crime began 1966, I guess, with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. So again, the thing with Ed Gein is, this relates to what I was saying before. In a way, he's never so much been part of true crime. His story has always been adapted into horror, which is a very different genre. He was this flesh and blood fairy tale monster whose story lends itself to being told and retold in horror stories.
And he's different from other notorious criminals in American history, like Ted Bundy, like Jeffrey Dahmer, because their names are so much more well known. I mean, Ed Gein obviously is infamous, but his story has been sliced for movies like Psycho, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like Silence of the Lambs, and the character has a different name there. So what do you think his impact then on true crime is?
On true crime,
Mm-hmm.
again, I think I hate to keep repeating myself. I mean, it's obviously true crime because it's, nonfiction. It actually happened. But Gein's influence really has, through Psycho to begin with, primarily been on the genre of horror. I see Gein as I grew up in the 1950s. I'm a baby boomer. And all the monsters in horror movies at that time came from somewhere else. Dracula from Transylvania and the Wolfman. There's a Wolfman of London and Frankenstein from whatever Eastern European country that was, or alien invaders from Mars. They were all foreign. Uh, Norman Bates was the first really all-American monster, and Ed Gein stands behind Norman Bates. So in that sense, uh, I think the Gein story Americanized horror in our culture. That has really been his primary impact.
Most recently, Ed Gein's story is being told on the newest season of Monster, the Netflix series created by Ryan Murphy, and past seasons include the Menendez brothers, as well as the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. And in the past, both Ryan Murphy and the series have faced criticisms, and those criticisms include re-traumatizing victims and their families, not consulting victims and their families for the stories. They've also been accused of adding moments that don't accurately portray or sensationalize exactly what happened, or glamorizing the killers. So A, what do you think of Gein's story being told this way? And do you think that it could be subject to similar criticism?
Well, I don't think it'll be criticized in terms of upsetting or offending families of victims, because it happened over 75 years ago. When I first went to Plainfield to do my research, there were still living relatives of Gein's victims. And the people of Plainfield were very, very sensitive at that time about anybody coming in to, as they saw it, exploit the story. Uh, as the years went by and the older generation passed, I think they've more embraced the notoriety, that the Gein story has brought them. So as far as that goes, I don't think they're liable to come into much criticism. As far as the other question goes, I mean, I myself am going to be watching it with great interest because nobody bothered to reach out to me from Ryan Murphy's camp to see, how they treat the material. I mean, from what I've seen of the trailers, again, they've turned it into another kind of over-the-top horror movie. They seem to have taken a lot of liberties with the story, which is fine. Again, Gein has achieved this mythic status, so any creator is entitled to treat that myth the way they see fit. But I am very curious and will be watching the series this weekend, to see how they treat the story.
That's really interesting that they didn't reach out to you because, I mean, you're the leading expert here on Ed Gein. I've read multiple stories from different media outlets on this upcoming series, and you're quoted in a lot of them. So what
Yeah.
do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think such things happen quite often in Hollywood. Um, I don't feel comfortable saying too much about it until I actually see the series. Um, but I will say, before Deviant came out, I think Gein's story, as it has become known, all derives from my book. Um, because before that, it was just a bunch of newspaper articles and magazine articles and Life and so on. So again, I'm going to be interested to see how the series treats uh, the story and to what, if any extent, it has relied on my book.
That's really interesting. I know in the past there have been series where, like I said before, Ryan Murphy's been accused of glamorizing killers. He's not the only person to have done that. I mean, Zac Efron, who has been considered a heartthrob for my generation, portrayed Ted Bundy. You have Charlie Hunnam portraying Ed Gein. And he looks, I mean, he has, based on the trailer, the droopy eye that you describe of Ed Gein, but I mean, he's a pretty good looking actor. Do you think that, what do you think that does to Ed Gein's legacy being portrayed in that way?
Well, the pictures I see, I mean, facially, Hunan has been made to look somewhat like Gein, who is actually, when you see him in certain photographs, a good looking enough guy. He obviously did not have the ripped physique of that we see in some of the promotional material for the show. Um, I just think it will make Gein, more widely known. I don't have any problem. Look, I mean, throughout American history, psychopathic killers have been glamorized and turned into myths. You look at somebody like Jesse James or Billy the Kid. I mean, these guys were psychopathic. I mean, they really were serial killers in a way. Um, but they've been turned into handsome, they've been played by movie idols and so on and so forth. So, in that regard, I don't have any problem with the way anybody might treat the Gein story. I mean, my only problem is presenting it, as strictly factual, because again, from the little I've seen of the series, they've taken quite a few liberties with the facts, which again, I don't have any problem with, except if people assume that that was what really happened.
And that's been a problem since the 50s. You wrote in your book that media coverage, I mean, stories were going from fact to fiction really fast. People could not get enough of these stories. And even, this is one of your quotes, townspeople felt exploited and victimized by the press, but there was fact and fiction that was embroidered and people couldn't differentiate between what was what. I mean, what do you think of that sensationalized media coverage that was happening then and could potentially be happening still over 70 years later, or close to 70 years later?
Well, I think, Ryan Murphy's Monster is not being offered as journalism. And there's a long history in American journalism of this kind of sensationalized tabloid coverage and these wild rumors being spread around in the immediate aftermath of the discovery of these crimes. I'm writing a book now about a serial killer from the 1890s, and the same thing happened with him. As soon as he was arrested, there were all these wild rumors being promulgated. So that's typical of tabloid journalism. And that, again, that certainly happened in Gein's case. I mean, people coming forward and claiming that he was a cannibal and that he had come to their house offering him supposedly venison, chunks of venison, which turned out to be human flesh. Those kinds of hysterical reactions are not uncommon when a crime is discovered. Again, this new season of Monsters is not being offered as journalism, so I don't see it exactly like that.
But you were the first person to really cobble together this
Mhm.
story and make
Mhm.
it one from start to finish of Ed Gein's childhood to the crimes thereafter. When you're
Mhm.
going through the media coverage then of it, I mean, how did you separate it and sift from fact to fiction?
Mm.
What was real about Eddie Gein, what wasn't?
Well, I did a lot of deep research. I went to Plainfield, spoke to people who knew him, spoke to people who had been inside his house. I interviewed psychiatrists who had treated him. I had access to uh, court records and psychiatric records. It is true, however, I mentioned earlier Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, obviously a very, very famous book. Capote called his book a nonfiction novel, by which he meant that he was employing fictional techniques in telling a factual tale. And we've come to know that there are many things in Cold Blood that were pretty much a product of Capote's creative imagination. In fact, the whole climactic scene of the book was pure invention on Capote's part. What Capote called a nonfiction novel has come to be known as creative nonfiction. Again, where you're employing these kind of novelistic techniques, because there's certain things you couldn't know. And, I was consciously emulating Capote's approach when I wrote Deviant. So, which is to say that there are certain scenes, particularly the beginning with his mother, that based on the documentary evidence I had about his relationship with his mother, I allowed myself to create these scenes because nobody really knows exactly the dialogue that took place between them. So yeah, so in the years since I wrote Deviant, I've come to think of myself not as so much a true crime writer, but a crime historian. So in the books I've written over the last 20 or 30 years, they're very scrupulously documented and footnoted. There's nothing in any of my books over the last 20 or 30 years that I can't point to a specific primary document that was the source of it. When I wrote Deviant, again, I was kind of taking as my motto. I'm sure you and your listeners are aware of Ken Kesey's book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The very last line of the first chapter, which I used to teach because I was a professor of American literature for many years, the narrator, the big chief, says, "You have to believe me, it's the truth even if it didn't happen." And
I like that. I like that.
and that was my conscious motto for some of what I was doing, with Deviant. My task was to take thousands of pages of dry material and turn it into a compelling story. And in order to do that, you have to apply these novelistic techniques. So, that's what I was doing in my book.
Well, you certainly did turn it into a compelling story because I listened to it, and a moment from childhood I can remember, the scariest movie I've ever seen happened to be Psycho. I was about 10 or 12, and I started crying watching that. I mean, this shower scene really freaked me out. I was listening to your book. That was scarier than my memory of Psycho was. But what about Eddie Gein's story do you think, based on all the other, all your other subjects, what makes his different than anything you've ever covered?
Well, Gein's story is different from any crime that I've ever heard of anywhere. I mean, I don't think
There's no comparison. There's no comparison.
No, there's no comparison. Again, a combination of factors: when it took place, where it took place, the character of Gein himself, but the disparity between, this, as I've said before, this nondescript, mild-mannered, seemingly good-natured, maybe he was seen as slightly simple-minded farmer, who is babysitting for his neighbors and running errands. And then, in the darkness of his remote farmhouse, performing these unspeakable, really kind of archaic acts, He was doing things, for example, that Aztec priests used to do when they, flayed the skins of their sacrificial victims and dressed themselves up in it. It's like something very ancient arose out of the depths, this disturbed man's psyche and possessed him, to perform these unimaginable deeds. When Gein revealed that he was digging up these the bodies came from the graveyards, that was much harder for people to believe than that he had gone around killing all these people. It's so beyond the bounds of, comprehension. So, yeah, I mean, as far as I have been able to determine in my many years of research, Gein is unique in not only in the annals of American crime, but world crime.
I mean, it definitely, after listening to your book, I mean, I'm definitely looking at people a little differently because, like you said, I mean, the most fascinating part is he presented in society, in his community for years one way, and then you
Hmm.
find out alone in his own home, he was a completely different person. But
Yeah.
Harold Schechter, I appreciate the conversation so much. Thank you for lending your expertise here today to dive into Ed Gein's story. I appreciate it. And you are welcome back anytime. I hope we can continue talking about more of your stories.
Happy to appear whenever you wish. Yes, it was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me on.